The house was still full of flowers, white lilies, roses, carnations. Their scent was thick, sweet, almost suffocating. They had been beautiful when they arrived, but now, only days later, their petals had begun to curl and brown at the edges. Margaret sat in her chair, the same one she had used for years, beside her husband's. The other chair, across from her, remained empty. She stared at it as if it might suddenly move. The funeral had passed in a blur, people hugging, speaking softly, leaving too soon. And now the silence had returned. She looked around the room that had been theirs, the photographs, the books, the untouched cup of tea he'd left behind that morning, and whispered, "How can the world still move when he doesn't?" Her eyes wandered to the clock. It ticked steadily, faithfully, indifferent to her loss. The flowers, once symbols of comfort, now stood as proof that even beauty fades quickly. And in the scent of wilting petals, she began to understand that grief is not loud. It's slow, quiet, and heavy as air. In the first week, her phone never stopped ringing. Voices filled her days, family, friends, neighbors, all saying kind things that she barely heard. Then, one morning, it stopped. The calls dwindled to 1 or 2 a week, then to none. The silence came not like a storm, but like snow, falling softly, covering everything until even sound felt distant. She sat often in the living room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the wood floor. Every noise reminded her that she was the only living thing that moved within these walls. At night, the loneliness became its own presence. She would wake and reach instinctively to her side, forgetting for a single second that there was no one there. Then she would turn over, face the darkness and whisper, "Lord, I can't hear anyone anymore, not even you." And in that moment, heaven heard her, but the answer was not yet ready to be spoken. Old habits die slowly, especially the ones built from love. Each morning she made tea and toast, 2 cups, 2 slices. Her hands moved out of memory, not thought. She would set 1 cup on the table where her husband used to sit. Then she would stop. The air would still. And she would quietly lift it again, pour it back into the pot, and sit down alone. The clink of the spoon against the porcelain was a lonely sound, a small reminder of everything missing. "Lord," she said one morning, eyes wet, "how long until I stop reaching for him?" But there was no answer. Just sunlight spilling across the table, landing on the empty chair as though it, too, longed to be filled. Sometimes she stared at that spot for minutes, imagining Jesus sitting there instead, invisible, silent, but somehow real. It was a fragile hope, but it kept her alive. Grief is strange. It turns absence into a presence. She could still smell his cologne in the bedroom, faint but certain. His coat still hung by the door, his shoes still waited by the mat, neatly side by side. She couldn't bring herself to move them. It felt like erasing him. Everywhere she went, she felt him there, not in body but in memory, in the rhythm of the house that had been theirs. She found herself talking out loud sometimes. "I saw the postman today," she would say, as if he were sitting in the chair, or, "You would have liked the light this morning." But each time the echo of her own voice came back too quickly, and it broke her heart a little more. One night, standing in the hallway, she pressed her hand against the wall and whispered, "I don't know how to live in a world where you're not in the next room." And somewhere, unseen, the one who was in the next room, the one who had promised never to leave, began to draw near. In the beginning, her children came every weekend. They brought groceries, asked how she was sleeping, helped her with the mail. They hugged her tightly when they left, whispering, "We'll be back soon, Mom." And they meant it, at least at first. But life moved forward for them. Work, families, noise, and for her, time stood still. The visits became phone calls. Then the phone calls became texts. And then, even those stopped. She told herself they were busy. She told herself not to be hurt. But every evening she would glance at the silent phone and feel the same ache rise inside. They've moved on, and I'm still here. Once, she started to call her son, but hung up before the first ring. "He'll call when he can," she said to no one. But the line stayed quiet and the house stayed empty. It wasn't anger that filled her heart, only sorrow, because nothing hurts quite like being forgotten by the ones you once carried. And yet, though her children forgot her, heaven did not. Another son was watching, one who never forgets his motherless and alone. Grief, she learned, makes people uncomfortable. At first, the neighbors brought food, casseroles, soup, sweet bread. They said gentle things, touching her shoulder, offering help. But after a few weeks, the smiles became shorter, the conversations thinner. They would wave from a distance, their eyes slipping away quickly, as though her sorrow were contagious. One afternoon, she overheard one of them whisper, "She's still not herself." The words stung. Who else would I be, she thought. She understood, though. The world doesn't know how to wait for those who grieve slowly. So she withdrew. She began to keep her curtains drawn, her doors closed, and when people passed by, she smiled faintly, but never expected them to stop. Her house became her refuge, and her prison. Still, in the quiet, she whispered, "If no one wants to stay, Lord, please stay." And though she felt nothing at that moment, a promise old as eternity answered her prayer. The mirror in her bedroom stood tall and elegant, framed in carved wood her husband had polished himself. She used to look into it each morning, fixing her hair, smiling faintly at the woman she once was. Now she passed by it quickly, sometimes even covering it with a scarf. It wasn't vanity, it was pain. The woman who looked back was still her, but her eyes had changed. There was a tiredness in them, a kind of absence she couldn't bear to see. She would trace her reflection's cheek with a trembling hand and whisper, "Where did I go?" Her loneliness had become a part of her face. Even her posture seemed smaller, folded inward, as if she were trying to make less space for her own sorrow. And yet, what she didn't see, what no mirror could show, was that her pain was being watched by someone who saw her beauty beyond the years, beyond the grief. Someone who called her not forgotten, but beloved. It was a cold evening when she finally prayed it. The air felt heavy, the kind of night when even the walls seemed to sigh. She sat at her table, the single lamp glowing dimly, the empty chair across from her waiting as always. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them. She didn't try to sound holy. She didn't try to find the right words. She just said what was true. "Lord," she whispered, "if no one comes anymore, please come yourself." Her voice broke on the last word. It wasn't a request, it was a surrender. She waited. The clock ticked, nothing moved. But somewhere, unseen, the prayer reached the one who had never stopped listening, and in heaven a promise stirred, not of words, but of presence. He would come, not to her door, but to her heart, not with noise, but with embrace. And soon, her empty house would no longer be empty. It was raining that night, the kind of rain that sounds like weeping against the glass. The wind sighed through the trees outside, and every sound seemed to echo her heart. She sat on the edge of her bed, clutching one of her husband's old sweaters. The scent of him had faded long ago, but she held it anyway, pressing it against her face. Something inside her cracked. The quiet, the distance, the forgotten calls. It all came rushing out. She slid to the floor, trembling, her tears spilling freely. "I can't carry this any more, Lord," she cried. Her voice broke on the words, and the sound filled the empty room. "I've tried to be strong. I've tried to believe. But I'm tired. I'm so tired." Her hands trembled against the cold floor. For a long time there was no sound but her sobbing. Then, exhausted, she whispered, "Please, just hold me. Even once." Her tears slowed, her breathing softened, and in that stillness, the darkness shifted. Not visibly, not loudly, but unmistakably. Something holy had entered the room. At first she thought the lamp had flickered. The shadows seemed softer now, the air warmer. It was the kind of warmth that wasn't of the air. It came from within, spreading gently through her chest, her shoulders, her trembling hands. Her crying stopped without her trying. She lifted her head slightly, sensing it. There was someone there. She couldn't see him, but the room itself felt alive, wrapped in a quiet that wasn't empty anymore. The loneliness that had haunted her for years began to dissolve, not because her pain was gone, but because she wasn't in it alone anymore. Her body relaxed, her hands opened. The air around her seemed to breathe, and then she knew, without seeing, without hearing, that Jesus had come. He hadn't knocked, he hadn't spoken, he had simply entered, carrying peace like light carries warmth. It began with a sense of nearness, a presence so real that she forgot to be afraid. Then slowly she felt it, arms, not imagined, not memory, real, strong, steady, and indescribably kind. They wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her gently against an invisible chest. No human warmth had ever felt like this. Her sobs returned, but they were different now, lighter, freer. She wept into that unseen embrace, as though her whole life had been waiting for it. The room was silent except for her soft crying, but within that silence there was rhythm, a heartbeat, calm and certain, pulsing against her grief. She didn't dare move. She only whispered, "Jesus, is that you?" And though no voice answered, she knew. Every part of her, heart, mind, memory, knew. The one who had been far was now closer than breath. Time disappeared. The room, the rain, the darkness, all of it faded until there was only the embrace. It was not like a vision or a dream. It was more real than both. Every hurt she had buried, the loneliness, the memories, the fear of being forgotten, began to rise to the surface, and with each breath they were lifted away. She felt seen, completely, tenderly, mercifully seen. There were no words, no explanations, only love, vast, patient, holy love, wrapping around her like the arms of eternity. And as he held her, she understood what she had never dared to believe. She had never been abandoned. Even in her darkest night, she had been held. The tears that once fell in despair now fell in healing. Her grief wasn't erased, it was embraced. And in that embrace, it began to change. She never heard words, not a single one. Yet, everything that needed to be said was somehow spoken. The air around her pulsed with meaning. Not through sound, but through peace. It was as though every question, every doubt, every tear had been answered, not by explanation, but by presence. She didn't ask him why he had waited so long, why the silence had lasted for years. She didn't need to. Every unspoken thought found its reply in the stillness. Every ache found its home in that divine quiet. It was love without speech, mercy without sound, the kind of communication that only souls can understand. She rested her head against what she could not see, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt safe again. No one had to say a thing. Heaven was speaking without words. She wept, but not like before. Her tears no longer fell from pain, but from relief. Each one felt lighter, as though years of sorrow were being lifted away, one drop at a time. The bitterness she had carried dissolved in their flow. She had cried alone so many nights that she'd forgotten tears could be holy, that they could cleanse instead of wound. Her shoulders loosened, her breath deepened, and she felt a quiet strength rise within her. It wasn't her own, it was his. And though the tears still fell, she smiled, a small, trembling smile through the weeping, because she finally understood that grief does not end by being silenced. It ends by being held. The next morning, sunlight spilled softly through the curtains. Margaret opened her eyes and for a moment forgot where she was. The room looked the same old chair, the same photograph by the bedside, the same clock ticking, but the air felt lighter, as if something sacred still lingered. She sat up slowly, her hands resting over her heart. The ache was still there, but it no longer felt sharp. It had softened like a scar touched by healing fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. It was all she could say. The memory of that embrace was too real to doubt. Even in the morning light it felt near, not as warmth now, but as peace. Her grief hadn't disappeared, but it no longer owned her. It had been gathered, held, and somehow transformed. The days passed quietly, each one gentler than the last. She began to open the curtains again. She made tea for herself without tears. She even sat in the garden one afternoon, feeling the sun on her face, whispering, "You're still here, aren't you?" And she felt it, faint but certain. That same nearness, that same peace. The neighbors noticed her change. Her steps were slower, but her eyes were brighter. There was something in her that couldn't be explained, a quiet joy, like a secret between her and heaven. When people asked how she was managing, she smiled softly and said, "I'm being held." Now, they didn't understand what she meant, but she did, because once you've been embraced by Jesus, even silence feels like company, and even sorrow begins to shine. A few weeks later, on a cool, bright morning, she went to the cemetery for the first time since the funeral. Her hands shook slightly as she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind her husband used to pick for her from the field behind their home. The grass was damp, the sky wide and clear. She walked slowly between the rows of stones, each one carrying a story, each one a fragment of love left behind. When she reached his grave, she knelt down carefully. Her tears came, but they were gentle now, not desperate, not aching, just real. She placed the flowers on the ground and brushed her fingers across the cold stone. "Hey," she whispered, smiling faintly. "I came to tell you something." Her voice trembled. "He found me. The Lord. He came to me. I'm not alone anymore." A breeze passed softly through the trees, and for a moment she could almost hear her husband's laughter in it. She closed her eyes and whispered, "He's with you now, and he's with me too." When she stood up, her heart felt light, lighter than it had in years. She left the grave not in grief, but in gratitude. Peace, she found, is not meant to be kept. It wants to be shared. One afternoon, she sat at her table with a pen and a stack of blank paper. Her handwriting was shaky, but her words were steady. Each letter began the same way. "Dear friend, I know what silence feels like. I know what it's like to be forgotten, but I also know the arms that never let go." She wrote to widows in her church, to women she'd met only once, even to names given to her by neighbors. Some replied, some didn't, but it didn't matter. She wrote for them all the same. Her small home began to fill with letters of thanks, with stories of others who had found comfort in her words. And each time she read one, she smiled and said softly, "It wasn't me who comforted them, Lord. It was you." Through her pain, she had become a messenger of tenderness, a living testimony that grief does not have the final word when love himself comes near. It came quietly, as most holy things do. The evening was soft, the air filled with the scent of rain and earth. She had grown weaker, her movements slower, her breath shallower, but she was not afraid. On the table beside her bed lay her Bible, its pages worn, and one of the letters she had written to comfort someone else. As she lay down, she smiled faintly and whispered her last prayer, "Thank you, Jesus, for holding me when no one else could." Her hands rested over her heart, her eyes closed, her breathing slowed. And as the lamp flickered beside her, the room began to glow with that same warmth she had once felt on the night of her breaking, the warmth of his presence. No words were spoken this time. There didn't need to be. She simply felt the arms around her once more, the same embrace that had healed her before, now come to carry her home. When she opened her eyes again, she was standing, strong, radiant, whole. Before her stretched a light so pure that it seemed to sing. And from that light came the one she had longed to see, Jesus. He walked toward her, his face calm, his eyes filled with the same love that had once met her in the dark. She didn't speak. She simply ran into his arms, laughing and weeping all at once. He held her close and complete, whispering softly, "I never let go." All the loneliness, all the tears, all the silent nights, gone. There was no sorrow here, no memory of pain, only love, alive and endless. He took her hand, and together they walked toward the horizon that had no dusk. The embrace had never ended. It had only begun again, forever.